Donald Trump was standing behind the White House podium reading fraud figures when Ilhan Omar walked through the door without an invitation, and the timing could not have been more brutal because she entered a room where the numbers were already doing the damage before she ever opened her mouth. Secret Service moved forward on instinct. Trump waved them off without hesitation, reached into his jacket, pulled out a black Sharpie, placed it beside a clean sheet of paper, and looked directly at Omar as if the interruption had saved him the trouble of finding her himself. "Let her stay. I've been waiting for this," he said, and in that instant, the blank page stopped looking like stationery and started looking like a ledger waiting for entries. Omar came in, loud, confrontational, already pushing her voice toward the back of the room, and that was the first mistake because volume can command attention, but it can also expose the difference between evidence and performance. Half the press corps had probably decided what kind of story they wanted before the first exchange was finished, but Trump was preparing to give them something harder to edit around. Numbers, names, convictions, dollar amounts, and a piece of paper that would keep getting darker. Omar accused Trump of using the presidential podium to attack her community, invoking his comments about Somalis, his attacks on her personally, and the long history of investigations surrounding his own political career, framing the entire confrontation as a federal vendetta against a sitting member of Congress. Cameras snapped toward Trump, then back toward Omar, because everybody in the room understood immediately that the press conference had stopped being a routine briefing and had become a confrontation built for replay, clipped headlines, cable panels, and millions of social media views. Trump did not look offended, rattled, or even especially interested in defending himself. He looked almost pleased, like a man watching the other side voluntarily walk onto ground he had already measured. He leaned toward the microphone, thanked Omar for showing up, and made the point with almost insulting simplicity. Now he did not have to talk about her from a distance because he could talk directly to her. Then he uncapped the Sharpie, put the first figure on the table, and let it sit there without decoration. $1 billion. That number was not offered as a metaphor, a slogan, or a campaign line. It was presented as the scale of fraud that the script attributes to federal prosecutions tied to Minnesota, Omar's state and political backyard. Trump moved immediately to Feeding Our Future, the $250 million scandal, 78 people indicted, 57 convicted, and what he described as the largest COVID fraud case in American history, refusing to let the exchange drift back into personality before the arithmetic had been established. Then came the daycare centers allegedly billing for children who did not exist, Medicaid programs supposedly treating patients who were never sick, autism therapy claims tied to people who did not have autism, and money meant to feed children allegedly flowing toward luxury vehicles, foreign property, and international travel. Trump kept the emphasis exactly where he wanted it. Not on feelings, not on identity, not on which politician could produce the loudest accusation, but on the grotesque distance between what taxpayers were told the money would do and what prosecutors said happened to it. He followed that with the most explosive figure in the opening stretch, the claim attributed in the script to a federal prosecutor that as much as half of $18 billion in federal program money sent to Minnesota since 2018 might have been stolen. The atmosphere shifted because $18 billion is not a number people absorb casually, and half of it is not a rounding error that can be buried under bureaucratic language or a carefully worded press release. Reporters who had been typing through the confrontation suddenly had a reason to stop because even in Washington, where trillion-dollar figures are thrown around until they lose meaning, billions allegedly disappearing through public programs still have the power to make a room go quiet. Trump wrote the first line on the sheet slowly, making the act itself part of the confrontation, and asked what people in the ordinary world would call conduct like that. His answer was theft, plain theft, the kind of word that removes the protective coating of administrative jargon and puts the issue in terms every taxpayer understands immediately. That was the architecture of the opening attack. Establish the money first, establish the prosecution second, establish the scale third, and only then force Omar to explain why the political conversation should be about Trump's tone instead of the whole sitting in the public ledger. Trump briefly turned toward the press and shifted into ridicule, recounting the story in the script about asking Somalia's president whether he wanted Omar back and claiming the response was essentially that Somalia already had enough problems. The joke drew the reaction Trump clearly expected, but the larger point was not the laugh itself. It was that Omar had entered the room trying to seize control through confrontation and instead found herself standing without a podium while Trump controlled the microphone, the figures, and the sequence. She had her voice, he had the room, and the imbalance became more obvious with every new line written on that sheet of paper. Trump looked again at the billion-dollar figure and kept building the argument that beginning with numbers was not accidental but strategic, because a number does not care whether the person questioning it is liked, hated, Republican, Democrat, immigrant, native-born, Muslim, Christian, or anything else. A spreadsheet does not retreat when somebody raises their voice. A conviction does not change because an accusation of prejudice enters the room, and a bank receipt does not suddenly become less real because the politics around it become uncomfortable. That was where Omar tried to change the battlefield, accusing Trump of attacking Muslim women, immigrants, and people who look like her, repeating his remarks about Somalis and invoking the "send her back" chant as evidence that the entire confrontation was rooted in racism rather than oversight. It was the strongest available political shield because an accusation of racism can instantly force the accused into defense, turning a discussion about conduct into a discussion about motive and making the person asking questions explain himself instead of requiring the subject to answer. Trump refused to accept that frame, and he did something more damaging than simply denying the accusation because he treated it as irrelevant to the evidence he wanted discussed. He picked up the Sharpie again and said they should talk about words, but instead of defending his own character, he moved straight toward Omar's public record. The maneuver was ruthless in its simplicity. If Omar wanted the confrontation to become a debate about language, Trump was prepared to put her language on trial first. He went directly to September 11, 2001, invoking the nearly 3,000 Americans killed, the firefighters who ran into collapsing buildings, the families receiving final phone calls, and the people trapped above the impact zones with choices no human being should ever face. Then he returned to Omar's phrase, "Some people did something," repeating it not as an isolated sentence, but against the scale of the event it had described. The contrast was the weapon, because 3,000 dead Americans and the deliberately understated phrase could be placed next to each other without Trump needing to manufacture any additional dialogue. He emphasized that those victims were not anonymous political symbols, but people with names still engraved at the memorial, individuals whose lives could not be reduced to the verbal distance created by some people. A reporter in the front row stopped writing. Omar's eyes dropped briefly before lifting again, and Trump kept moving because he had no intention of allowing the confrontation to settle after the first example. He shifted next to Omar's comments about American support for Israel and the phrase, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby," presenting it as another case where her own words had created a controversy large enough that members of her own party publicly demanded an apology. Trump stressed that this was not something created by his administration, conservative media, or an anonymous online account, because the statement had appeared under Omar's own name and had generated criticism from Democratic leadership itself. Nancy Pelosi became useful to his argument precisely because she was not Trump. Because when a political ally tells you publicly that your language crossed a line, it becomes much harder to dismiss every criticism as partisan hatred. Trump continued writing on the page, each new line turning the clean sheet into a visual inventory of controversies that had accumulated around Omar long before she entered that press room. The argument was becoming increasingly difficult to redirect because Trump was not asking the audience to trust his opinion of Omar. He was presenting the confrontation as a review of Omar's own statements and the institutional reactions that followed them. Then came the Foreign Affairs Committee, where Trump pointed to the House vote that removed Omar from that position, emphasizing that Congress, not Trump personally, had taken that action. He cited the 218 to 211 vote and hammered the point that people who worked in the same institution, rode the same elevators, sat in the same committees, and understood the responsibilities attached to that assignment had voted to take the seat away from her. The script frames that vote as another piece of the same record, another item that could not simply be erased by saying the criticism came from one hostile president standing at one hostile podium. Trump then turned Omar's accusation of Islamophobia back on her, arguing that the United States had accepted an 8-year-old refugee from an African camp and created the conditions in which she could eventually become a member of Congress. He was no longer merely answering an interruption at a press conference. He was building the case that Omar's biography could explain her journey, but it could not function as permanent immunity from scrutiny over the words, votes, money, and controversies that came after it. Omar's hands pressed flat against the sides of her jacket, while the aide behind her leaned in and briefly touched her shoulder, a small gesture that carried more weight than any shouted interruption because it suggested the confrontation had moved beyond the point where volume alone could restore control. She shook the hand away at first, not because the support was unwelcome, but because accepting comfort in that moment would have looked like surrender while every camera in the room was hunting for exactly that image. Trump kept his attention on the record instead of her reaction, because the central weakness in Omar's defense, as the script framed it, was that accusing the questioner of racism only worked if the questioner agreed to spend the rest of the exchange defending his own character. He refused, treating the accusation like background noise and answering it with transcripts, votes, financial filings, and statements carrying Omar's own name rather than with a speech about his intentions. That refusal was the pivot, because the confrontation stopped being about whether Trump could prove he was not prejudiced and became about whether Omar could explain why every controversy attached to her record should disappear the moment she described scrutiny as discrimination. That political mechanism was familiar enough that everyone in Washington understood how it normally worked. The accusation landed, the accused panicked, consultants began whispering about optics, and the original subject of the argument vanished under a new debate about tone, identity, and motive. Trump did not play that version of the game, and the more Omar tried to frame the confrontation as an attack on who she was, the more aggressively he dragged it back toward what she had said, what had been filed, what had been paid, and what institutions had already done in response. The point was not subtle and was never meant to be subtle because a transcript cannot be intimidated by an accusation and a recorded vote cannot be shamed into changing its result. Trump had effectively told the room that if Omar wanted to argue racism, she would first have to walk through every public controversy he had already placed on the table, one by one, without skipping the uncomfortable parts. That was when Omar changed tactics, lowering her voice and abandoning the shouting that had defined her entrance, because she understood that emotional biography could reach an audience in a way procedural argument sometimes could not. She reminded Trump that she had survived civil war, that she had been 8 years old, that she had spent 4 years in a refugee camp, and that she had arrived in the United States with nothing before eventually winning a seat in Congress. Then she contrasted that history with Trump's upbringing, pointing to wealth, privilege, and the fact that he had never known the kind of hunger or displacement that shaped her childhood, before telling him that he did not get to define what being American meant for her. For a moment, the emotional center of the room shifted because this was no longer a dispute over committee votes or federal program money, but a direct comparison between two radically different American biographies. Trump did not reach immediately for the Sharpie, and when he answered, the performance loosened slightly because even he acknowledged that the story of a refugee child reaching Congress was precisely the kind of story the United States was built to make possible. But he refused to let that biography become a shield, arguing that suffering in childhood could explain the road someone traveled without granting permanent immunity from scrutiny over every decision made afterward. That distinction became the bridge into the next financial attack, and Trump did not waste time softening it because the script's sequence was designed to move from moral biography straight back into money. He raised the claim that Omar's campaign had paid approximately $2.8 million to the E Street Group, the consulting firm associated with Tim Meanett, who later became her husband, and emphasized that the scale of those payments had increased sharply during the period under scrutiny. Trump referenced the FEC complaints and the criticism surrounding the arrangement, then stressed that the contract was eventually ended only after millions of dollars had already passed through their relationship. The argument was brutal because it did not need to prove that personal hardship had been false. It only needed to insist that a difficult past did not answer present-day questions about campaign spending. Omar's refugee story could be moving, historic, and genuinely American, while still being completely irrelevant to whether voters were entitled to examine where campaign money went and who benefited from it. Trump kept moving before Omar could rebuild momentum, turning next to the business ventures connected to Minnet and presenting them as another chapter in the same financial pattern rather than an unrelated curiosity. The script points to a California winery, a fraud lawsuit brought by an investor, and additional debt allegedly owed to marijuana growers in South Dakota, all of which Trump used to turn the conversation from political ideology into the simpler question of whether the people around Omar had demonstrated sound judgment with money. He mocked the business record with a reference to The Apprentice, not because the joke proved anything, but because ridicule made the financial narrative easier for the audience to remember than a page of campaign filings ever could. The laughter that followed was short and uncomfortable, exactly the kind that erupts when reporters know they are supposed to remain detached, but the line lands before professionalism can catch up. Trump then turned away from Omar and looked directly into the camera, widening the target of the argument beyond one congresswoman and one press room. He began talking about immigrants who had come to the United States through ordinary legal channels, people who had waited, studied for citizenship tests, raised their right hands, taken the oath, worked multiple jobs, driven children to school before sunrise, and paid taxes without expecting public recognition for any of it. The contrast was deliberate because Trump wanted the audience to compare the quiet discipline of those lives with the political privilege he was accusing Omar of exploiting, especially the ability to move millions through campaign structures while presenting every question about the arrangement as an attack on identity. He said those immigrants were the people he worked for, not people who gamed the system, and the framing was designed to separate criticism of Omar from criticism of immigration itself. In that construction, the attack was not aimed at refugees or Muslims as a class, but at a politician whose personal history, according to Trump, had become a rhetorical shield against financial and ethical scrutiny. Whether the room agreed or not, the strategy was clear. Remove Omar's ability to claim exclusive ownership of the immigrant story by placing millions of other immigrants beside her and asking why their obedience to ordinary rules received less attention than her biography. Omar's shoulders dropped and the aide behind her reached again for her elbow, and this time she did not pull away, allowing the gesture to remain while her eyes lowered toward the floor. The confrontation had shifted again because Trump was no longer talking to the reporters in front of him. He was talking past them, directly to viewers who had worked ordinary jobs, filled out their own tax returns, worried about bills, and never expected a political exception if they made a mistake. The script uses the image of an immigrant woman closing a dry cleaning shop after decades of work, a person with no consulting firm, no national platform, and no ability to turn a legal or financial question into a televised political defense. That comparison was not presented as neutral social commentary, but as an accusation of double standards. The idea that ordinary people face rules as rules, while powerful people are permitted to turn those same rules into ideological disputes. Trump's argument was becoming less about Omar personally and more about the resentment that grows when taxpayers watch public officials operate inside a system that appears to offer protections unavailable to everyone else. Omar finally returned to Trump's own words, reminding him that he had called her garbage, claimed Somalia did not want her, talked about citizenship, and raised the possibility of deportation, then framed the entire event as the punishment imposed when a black Muslim woman challenged the most powerful political figure in the country. Her voice cracked, and for the first time, the force of the accusation seemed less like a prepared performance and more like someone trying to find a line strong enough to stop an argument that had refused every previous exit. Trump picked up the Sharpie again, and the room immediately recognized what the gesture meant, because every previous time the marker moved, another item had entered the record he was building in front of the cameras. He told Omar to sit down because he wanted to tell her something, but she remained standing, and that refusal only sharpened the visual imbalance between the person controlling the podium and the person attempting to challenge it from the press section. Then Trump moved toward the most explosive and personally damaging section of the entire confrontation, the long-running allegations surrounding Omar's marriages and immigration history. He started with Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi and repeated allegations that had circulated for years, including claims made publicly by people presented in the script as members of Omar's own community who alleged that Elmi was her brother. Trump was careful, at least rhetorically, to frame the allegation as something others had said rather than as something originating with him, but he clearly intended the distinction to provide no emotional relief because he immediately connected the allegation to tax filings and marriage records. He pointed to the claim that Omar had filed joint tax returns with Ahmed Hirsi, the father of her children, during a period when she was legally married to Elmi, presenting the overlap as the kind of paperwork discrepancy that would bring immediate scrutiny if an ordinary taxpayer were involved. The line of attack worked precisely because tax law sounds boring until someone suggests that the rules may have been bent, and then every viewer who has ever worried about signing the wrong line on a return suddenly understands the stakes. Trump's point was not that paperwork is glamorous. It was that paperwork is where excuses die because dates, signatures, names, and legal statuses sit on the page without caring how compelling somebody's public biography might be. He then turned to the 2017 divorce petition described in the script, emphasizing that Omar had represented to the court that she could not locate Elmi and did not know where he was, language made more serious by the fact that legal filings are submitted under formal obligations of truthfulness. Trump paused before delivering the next detail because the contrast was more damaging when separated by silence. The script says social media material later showed Omar and Elmi together in London before the period in which she had claimed she could not locate him. The room, according to the source, became almost completely still, with reporters lowering phones and keyboards going quiet because the argument had moved from broad political controversy into specific dates, filings, photographs, and representations allegedly made to a court. Trump kept writing on the paper, turning each claim into another visible line, while Omar gripped the chair in front of her, and the tone hardened because the remaining allegations carried potential legal consequences far beyond a bad headline or a committee vote. What had started with Minnesota fraud numbers and a billion-dollar figure was now moving directly toward immigration records, alleged marriage fraud, alleged perjury, and the question Trump intended to make impossible for Omar to avoid. Trump did not let the silence rescue Omar, because silence was useful only if he allowed it to become an exit, and he clearly had no intention of giving her one after spending the entire confrontation narrowing the argument from broad political accusations to specific documents, dates, names, and filings. He said the Department of Justice was pulling her immigration file, that Tom Homan's team had been reviewing records for months, and that Senator Ted Cruz had identified 3 federal statutes tied in the script to marriage fraud, immigration fraud, and perjury. Trump then attached the penalties described in the source, up to 5 years for each offense, fines reaching $250,000 per count, and the possibility of deportation, making the stakes sound less like cable news controversy and more like the kind of legal exposure that ordinary people understand immediately because there is nothing abstract about prison time, fines, and citizenship consequences. Omar's grip tightened around the chair in front of her, and the image became almost embarrassingly simple. One person speaking from the presidential podium with a sheet of allegations filling line by line, the other holding onto furniture, while the discussion moved deeper into records she had spent years insisting proved nothing. Trump was no longer arguing that people should dislike Omar. He was arguing that the accumulation of unresolved questions had become too large to hide behind outrage, biography, identity, or the assumption that asking them was somehow disqualifying. Omar grabbed a reporter's microphone and immediately rejected the allegations as debunked, insisting that fact-checkers and investigations had already dealt with them, but Trump did not allow the exchange to become another sprawling argument over competing summaries and partisan interpretations. He set the Sharpie down, looked directly at her, and reduced years of controversy to the shortest challenge in the entire confrontation. Then take the test. The brutality of the line came from its simplicity, because he was not asking her to deliver another speech, explain another filing, accuse another opponent, or debate another network's fact check. He was presenting a single physical test as the answer to the central allegation he had just repeated. The script then brings in the claim that a man had offered Omar $1 million and a red Ferrari if she could prove Ahmed Elmi was not her brother, and Trump used that offer not as independent proof, but as pressure, as a way of asking why an apparently definitive opportunity had not been accepted. One cotton swab, 5 seconds, one answer, one public controversy supposedly ended forever, and Trump hammered that contrast because every additional word from Omar risked sounding more complicated than the solution he was placing in front of her. She held the microphone but did not answer into it, and that silence became the centerpiece of Trump's next move because the entire press room had been trained for an hour to react to whatever came after the Sharpie stopped moving. Trump told her that she would not do it, and the tone changed again, dropping the jokes, the crowd work, and the exaggerated rhythm that had punctuated earlier attacks, replacing them with something colder and more final. "Because we know exactly what you did," he said, and in the logic of the script, that sentence was designed to function as a verdict rather than another allegation, even though the underlying claims remained exactly the claims already listed in the source. He added that Omar herself knew, deep down where the cameras could not reach, that the people questioning her already understood the truth, pushing the confrontation away from documentary argument and into psychological accusation without adding any new event beyond the script. Omar's breathing was visible, her chin dropped, the borrowed microphone hung uselessly in her hand, and when the reporter reached over to take it back, her fingers opened one at a time, and she let it go without resistance. Trump returned to the sheet of paper and wrote the final line, completing the visual device that had begun when Omar first walked into the room and the page was still empty, because now every section of the confrontation had been converted into another black mark on the same surface. He held the page toward the cameras, presenting the collection of figures, quotes, controversies, and allegations as if the physical existence of the list itself proved the larger point that there was too much material to dismiss casually. Then he set it down, capped the Sharpie, and delivered the final personal attack of the exchange, saying Omar had not come to America to become part of it, but had come to use it. Nobody moved, and the room's stillness mattered because the script had built the confrontation around constant noise, constant interruption, constant accusations, and then ended the direct clash by removing all of them at once. What remained was the paper, the microphone no longer in Omar's hand, Trump still controlling the podium, and a collection of allegations the script wanted the audience to view not as disconnected controversies, but as a single pattern. The monologue then pivots away from the press room and directly toward the viewer, insisting that the audience already knew nearly every figure, quote, allegation, and dollar amount before watching the confrontation, and therefore had not come to discover a hidden secret. The point becomes that none of this material was presented as newly uncovered. The allegations involving Omar's marriage had circulated since 2016. The "some people did something" clip had been replayed countless times. Campaign finance filings were publicly accessible, and the Minnesota fraud cases had been part of federal court proceedings since 2022. According to the script, the real reason the confrontation felt different was not that Trump revealed something previously invisible, but that he was willing to say the entire list directly to Omar's face without apologizing, retreating, or allowing accusations of racism to interrupt the sequence. That is where the script widens its target from Omar to the political culture surrounding her, arguing that the problem is not simply one congresswoman's record, but a system in which certain accusations can function like an emergency shutoff switch, ending scrutiny before the underlying questions are answered. The accusation at the heart of that argument is viciously straightforward. If every question about money, marriage, taxes, immigration records, or public statements can be converted instantly into a debate about prejudice, then the evidence no longer has to be defeated because the person asking about it can be punished instead. The script insists that this mechanism works because most politicians care deeply about the consequences of being labeled racist, anti-immigrant, or anti-Muslim, especially when those labels can dominate headlines long after the original issue disappears. Consultants understand it, elected officials understand it, reporters understand it, and the people being questioned understand it, which creates an environment where staying quiet can become professionally safer than following the evidence into an ugly confrontation. That, according to the source's argument, is why questions can remain alive for years in kitchens, living rooms, group chats, and ordinary conversations while becoming strangely difficult to ask from official podiums where careers and reputations are at stake. The script does not present Omar as the inventor of that system, but it accuses her of using it exceptionally well, repeatedly converting scrutiny of conduct into accusations about the motives of the people doing the scrutinizing. Trump's significance in this narrative is therefore not that he uncovered every document himself, but that he was willing to ignore the political punishment attached to the questions and continue reading the list after the accusation designed to stop him had already been made. From there, the argument returns to ordinary Americans, immigrants, and native-born citizens alike, people who file taxes, stand in line at government offices, pay bills, follow instructions on official forms, and understand that a mistake involving money or legal status can trigger consequences without anyone first asking about their biography. The script asks the audience to imagine what would happen if one of those people filed a false tax return, entered a fraudulent marriage for immigration purposes, or redirected money belonging to other people into a spouse's company, and it answers with the claim that they would not receive a national platform from which to reframe the investigation as discrimination. They would face auditors, investigators, courtrooms, penalties, and the ordinary machinery of enforcement, which is why the perceived double standard becomes more important to the monologue than any single insult exchanged in the press room. The argument is not that Omar's childhood did not matter or that prejudice does not exist, but that biography and identity cannot be allowed to operate as permanent exemptions from the same accountability demanded of everyone else. By this point, the script has stopped trying to win a dispute between two politicians and started trying to convince the viewer that the larger scandal is a culture in which asking certain questions has become more dangerous than leaving them unanswered. The script's final argument is that ordinary Americans do not experience accountability as an optional political exercise, because when they sign a tax return, submit an immigration form, accept public money, or certify information to a court, the government does not stop enforcing the rules simply because the questions are uncomfortable. They understand paperwork in the most practical way possible. One wrong number can trigger a letter, one unexplained discrepancy can trigger an audit, and one false statement can become far more serious than the person who signed it ever imagined. That is why the contrast presented throughout the confrontation is supposed to feel so infuriating, because the people watching from home are asked to compare their own exposure to consequences with the layers of political protection surrounding somebody powerful enough to turn every investigation into a national argument about motive. The script insists that this double standard is not some abstract theory invented by partisan commentators, but something millions of citizens believe they recognize whenever they watch influential people survive controversies that would destroy the career, finances, or reputation of an ordinary worker. And once that perception takes hold, every unanswered filing, every disputed payment, every unresolved allegation, and every attempt to redirect the question becomes another reason for distrust rather than another reason to move on. That is where the monologue returns to its most basic weapon. Numbers do not understand fear, receipts do not have a religion, payroll records do not care about political identity, and a signed form does not become less important because the person whose name appears on it has a compelling personal story. A bank transaction does not know whether the person reading it voted Republican or Democrat, and a campaign expenditure does not suddenly acquire moral immunity because somebody describes scrutiny as prejudice. The question, what happened to the money, remains the same question whether it is asked by a prosecutor, an auditor, a journalist, a voter, or somebody sitting at a kitchen table trying to understand why the rules seem brutally precise for ordinary people and strangely negotiable for the politically connected. That is the core of the script's closing case, because it argues that accountability collapses the moment the identity of the person being questioned becomes more important than the evidence being examined. If the evidence is strong, then the evidence should survive scrutiny, and if the accusation against the evidence is simply that asking about it is offensive, then the script argues the public has every reason to keep asking harder. The monologue then strips away the personalities entirely and reduces the dispute to a principle that any employer, shareholder, taxpayer, or neighbor would understand. When somebody is trusted with money, authority, legal status, or public responsibility, questions about how that trust was used are legitimate until the record provides a satisfactory answer. Nobody should have to check the race, religion, birthplace, gender, political party, or personal history of the person involved before deciding whether a financial document deserves examination. Nobody should need permission from a committee before reading a public filing, and nobody should have to calculate the professional cost of asking why two documents appear to tell different stories. The script's anger is aimed precisely at that hesitation, the instinct to look at the social consequences of the question before looking at the substance of the evidence behind it, because once institutions begin deciding that certain people are too politically dangerous to scrutinize openly, accountability no longer depends on what happened. It depends on whether the person asking is willing to survive the backlash. That, according to the script, is why the most important question at the end is not whether the controversies surrounding Omar existed, because the source insists that many of the quotations, financial records, Political disputes and allegations had already circulated publicly for years. The real question is why so much of the material could remain in public view while still feeling politically radioactive enough that most officials would rather discuss anything else. Why did the marriage allegations first raised years earlier continue circulating instead of disappearing completely under definitive public evidence? Why did campaign finance controversies keep generating suspicion? And why did Minnesota fraud cases become part of a much broader argument about political accountability in the state? The monologue's answer is that the system rewarded avoidance because anybody willing to push aggressively could immediately be forced into defending his own motives rather than continuing to interrogate the underlying record. In that environment, silence becomes cheaper than confrontation, and unresolved questions survive not because nobody has heard them, but because too many people decide that asking them publicly carries more risk than leaving them alone. Trump, in the logic of this script, becomes important because he does not respond to that political calculation the way a conventional office holder is expected to respond. He does not hear an accusation of racism and immediately abandon the previous topic. He does not retreat into a carefully drafted statement about respect, and he does not surrender control of the argument to the person who changed the subject. Instead, he keeps returning to the page, to the numbers, to the quotations, to the votes, to the filings, and to the allegations already placed in front of the audience, treating every attempt to redirect him as another reason to continue rather than another reason to stop. That refusal is the entire mechanism behind the confrontation, because the script does not portray him as discovering a secret file hidden in a basement somewhere in Washington. It portrays him as saying publicly what the author believes others had been too cautious to say directly. The Sharpie matters only because it represents that refusal in physical form, each black line telling the audience that the next accusation will not erase the previous entry. By the end, the blank sheet from the beginning of the press conference has become the organizing image for the entire argument because Omar entered while it contained nothing and left facing a page covered with the controversies the script had stacked against her in sequence. The paper itself proves nothing, but within the rhetoric of the piece, it becomes a symbol of accumulation. The idea that one disputed issue can be explained away, another can be called partisan, another can be described as old news, but eventually the pile becomes the story. The monologue wants the viewer to believe that this is why the confrontation feels more significant than a normal exchange between two political enemies. Not because either person suddenly changed, but because the usual escape routes were deliberately closed. Omar could accuse Trump, invoke biography, appeal to identity, challenge his legitimacy, or attack his motives, but the script repeatedly returned to the same demand that the underlying record still had to be confronted. That is the pressure point the entire four-part sequence has been building toward from the first billion-dollar figure onward. The final accusation therefore reaches beyond Omar and lands on the institutions surrounding political power. Institutions the script portrays as more concerned with avoiding explosive labels than with forcing uncomfortable answers into the open. If reporters, lawmakers, investigators, and political leaders become so afraid of being accused of prejudice that they stop asking obvious questions, then the public will eventually stop trusting the people whose job was supposed to be asking those questions in the first place. That distrust does not vanish because officials tell voters to calm down, and it does not disappear because a controversy has been discussed before. In many cases, repetition without resolution only makes the suspicion worse. The script's position is uncompromising. Questions about public money, legal filings, political conduct, and government programs should be answered with evidence, not neutralized by changing the subject to the identity of the person involved. Once that standard disappears, equal treatment under rules becomes a slogan instead of a reality. So the final question is not presented as whether an investigation can produce headlines, because headlines have never been the scarce resource in Washington, And it is not whether politicians can accuse each other of dishonesty, because they have been doing that for generations. The question is why it supposedly required a political figure with almost no interest in conventional restraint to place the allegations together, refuse to apologize for asking about them, and continue after every attempt to make the act of questioning itself the controversy. The script answers that the system had become dependent on hesitation, on people calculating reputational risk before opening their mouths, on officials wondering whether the label attached to the question would hurt them more than the unanswered evidence would hurt the person being questioned. Trump's advantage in that environment, according to the monologue, was not subtlety, diplomacy, or restraint. It was precisely his willingness to operate without the fear that made everyone else step away from the confrontation. And on that Tuesday afternoon in the White House press room, with a black Sharpie resting beside a sheet of paper that had started completely blank, the script closes on one image and one message. The page was not blank anymore because somebody had finally decided to write every question down and refuse to erase it.